We have a number of different things here. I think these can all be seen on the wide. So what we have is we have our tungsten lighting location pack. We have some gels. These are all our gels here, rolls of and a pack. And we also have LED panels. Obviously, depending on what you're looking at, and like I said, please, anybody ask questions in YouTube and Joel will feed them back to me. It might take a few minutes. It obviously depends on your scenario. So if we're going out and filming, personally, whenever I go out and film for university-related things, I'll be taking these. I think this should be a set of 3 redheads, or it should be some redheads and ARRI 650s. And so the difference between them is the redheads are red and the ARRIs are blue. Don't worry, I'll get them out and show them to you in a minute. Now, there's a reason for that, rather than, I like LEDs, we do take the LEDs. Now, there are different use cases for these. I think the first thing to understand is simple things like power consumption. LEDs will be run off of batteries, or they can be run off the mains. The tungsten lights will have to be run off the mains because of how much power they consume. So the upside to that, though, is these are far brighter, far more powerful, and when we get into a more complicated area, their color rating index is far superior to the LEDs. That's just a fact. LEDs are catching up with that, but you'd need some very, very high-end, expensive ones to be matching that. I think perhaps we should get them out and have a little look at them. That might be interesting. That might be nice. Have we had anything through, Joel, from the YouTube? Any messages, any statements, any questions? Nothing yet. Well, I'm not surprised, as is the case. Right, so, oh, this has got the Godox panel. So, yes, this has 3 different bits in it. We'll have a look at that properly in a second. So what is currently in here is here we have our redheads. Right, so can we see that? Is that in focus, Joel? Or is it hideously out of focus? It's in focus, marvellous. You're a bit quiet on my end, Joel. Right, so, here are the redheads. So, this is basic tungsten light. The thing about tungsten lights is they contain bulbs. I don't know how well you can see that. Can we see a bulb okay there? You can see it very well, wonderful. So, that's a bulb. That's a physical, actual bulb with a filament. Obviously, like, you know, as house lamps used to be, back when I were a lad. You have a piece of metal sealed in a vacuum tube, well, mostly vacuum, and what happens is a current is passed through that, it heats up due to resistance, that creates an amazing powerful light. We can shape the light with our barn doors, and so what these are used for is if you don't want to cover a whole area with your light, you can pick these up and pull them in and shape your light that way. A thing to understand about tungsten lights rather than LEDs is they get hot. I mean really, really hot. Hideously hot, some might say. This is why all of these kits will come with a set of gloves. If you're handling these lights and they're on, you must be using gloves. It's terribly important. So we have like I said, we have the redheads and we have the ARRI 650s. I'm going to try and pull these out. These cables do get a little jumbled together, I will not lie. So, as you can see, very similar. We have the barn doors on these. These barn doors rotate quite nicely. I think the other ones do as well. But these have a very smooth, very loose action on those. They do, the other real upside about taking tungsten lights to a shoot is it looks like a film. When you think of a light for films, you think of something like this, probably much larger in the 1000 watt, probably 1.2, maybe even 2K range. These are called a 650 because they draw 650 watts of power. I'm not going to explain the fact that amperage times voltage equals wattage consumption. That is an important thing to consider, though, for when you are taking something like this out. What we have here, so these are 650 watts in power. So that's it's not massively powerful. You have to remember that film lights can go up to anything to about 2K, to when you're on very, very high-end sets, that can be up to 10K in power, which is an incredibly powerful light. So right now, 650, that'd be good for illuminating a house, it'd be good for illuminating a room. You know, you could even have them outside and they would produce a very powerful widespread light. We'll show some of these on in a minute. I just want to walk you through what we have in the box at the minute. So that's a 650. So ARRIs, we sometimes call them ARRI Blues because they are blue. Now back to the Redhead. They look smaller, but these are in fact more powerful. A Redhead is usually 800 watts of light. That's a typical standard for it. We call 1Ks would usually be referred to as blondes. They've usually got yellow backs. Redheads will be made by a number of different manufacturers, but they generally tend to all be red, just not even as an industry standard type thing, just as a something that can be understood generally within industry. It's not so much a standard as it is a custom, really. You'll find that filmmaking is full of customary ideas. So let's perhaps set one up, and then we can get an idea of what it looks like. So I'm going to quickly grab a light stand. We've got a number of these. Now, one of the things to remember, obviously one light per stand. When you're setting up a light stand, can you bring back to camera 2 for me, Joel? You want to take your light stand, it wants to be like this. Don't put it out like this, that's not safe, it's not sensible. These spreaders need to be running inverse to your legs. That's why they're being more stable. They are more secure. Can you come back to camera 1 for me, please, Joel? Right, so we're going to set this up. So I'm popping this down here. I'm going to pop it back a little bit just so you can see what I'm doing. I know that this isn't the world's greatest setup at the minute, but we're 2 people running an entire TV studio. It's not exactly one. So for the time being, we'll set up this little ARRI 650. I'll bring this close up to camera 2 again for us, Joel. So we can see that there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to place this on top here. Now, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this. You can see that I'm loosening this bit on the base here. You can see that is out of focus, isn't it, Joel? Not really, it's in focus? Okay, that's fine. So, what you can see is on this just has a hole here that will fit on top of this. We loosen the screw till it comes out, this bolt, and then to keep it in place, we'll tighten it back up. Now, really, you want to put your light on in situ, preferably not moving it whilst it's on. I mean, certainly once the light is turned on, we're not moving it. Thank you for that cut, Joel. So as you can see, so that's there. We will move this. It's fine for these smaller lights, but once they start getting more top heavy, do not move them on light stands. It's not a sensible idea. And if you are going to move them, keep the cable in one hand and lift it from the actual light stand itself. You know, that way you're holding it at the point, and that way you've got it spread, open, ready to go. So we're going to move this over to here. I will have to grab my extension lead in a minute. I think that's a nice enough place to put it. We'll put it as like a, you know what, I'm actually going to move it over to here, and we'll use it as a, we'll use this as a key for a laugh. I'll only do a 2, I should do a 3-point light, but I'll probably do a polite 2-point light. I think it'll be easier. It'll be certainly easier to see. Actually, you know what? No, I think we'll be able to do a 3-point light quite happily. So if I pull this over to here, what I can now do is place my power lead over there. Now we'll be lifting up the light. Now, can you see, Joel? Can you easily see that I'm using the? You can see that there. So what happens is these come in 3 sections. We have this standard base section here. Then we have, which we can loosen with this one. And we can lift that up like that. And then we have a secondary one here. We can lift up here. And so you can see that comes in 3 sections. We've got this section that never really moves. There's a length of pole inside of that. And there's a length of pole inside of that pole. These can go very, very high. But I really suggest you do not really lift them up any higher than about, you know, sort of about, I'd say 7 foot really. Anything higher than that is not sensible, and I'll also show you what else we'll be using to go with these. So, Yes, yes indeed, Joel, we will be using the sandbags. There's too much excitement amongst the tech office about sandbags. Right, these do pivot on a yoke here. I'm thinking yoke is the technical term. I may be wrong in that. So what we want to do is open these barn doors. Remember, we're not turning this on at any point. We want to find our light in situ before we turn it on. These get too hot to be really sensible, to be handling, you know, for fine tuning. You want to find where you want to place that light and fine tune it afterwards, but you really don't want to be moving it about, certainly whilst it's on, and they take quite a while to cool down. So, we have our light here. We can pivot that, we can choose that's going to be. Now, I'm just trying to think. That at that height, I would be wary of leaving it on its own. I'm not saying I wouldn't leave it on its own, but I would want to place something on there. So, can you bring me up camera 2, Joel? Here we have a sandbag. I can't tell you the actual weight of these. They're fairly hefty. I wouldn't want to be carrying too many of them. So if you're going out to a woods, I would take some because obviously it's windy, obviously it's uneven ground, but they are not light. I'm going to turn camera 2 round a little bit quickly just to get a sort of shot of here. I'm going to place it there and I'm going to move. Oh, this needs to be locked off. Or it's just a bit top heavy. Sure. I'm going to leave it like that. Tell me if camera 2 starts dipping. You know, I like the fact that I said don't move it, but here we go. Now, if you can see that there, what I would like to do is that we place a sandbag, goes over these legs. These are why these legs also need to dip inwards like that. Yeah, bring me up camera 2. Thanks, John. These are why these legs dip inwards like this, is so that when the sandbag goes over, it has something to go over. The sandbag should be touching the floor, because these can't bear the weight of the sandbag. They're really only there to hold stability, but now we know that if it moves in this direction, it's not going to tip all the way, right? If you're on a particularly windy day, I'd have one for each leg. You know, that would be a real scenario, especially if this goes high, because these are quite prone to wavering about, and we don't want that. So, what I will do is I'll move this back to where we were going to have it. So I lift it from here, bring it over. I can have that there. I can bring this and frame it back up on a nice chair. I'm going to leave that still a little bit low so you can see that we've got stuff. We come back to camera 2. Can you remember these? These all have, on camera 2, these all have standard wall lamp plugs, as you can see. These are fine for using in houses. Once you get much bigger in size though, 2K, 1K or above probably wouldn't be used in a house. Not without some sort of generator or transformer or something like that. And even then I find it unlikely. So remember that for your lighting needs if you're out on location, that these can only do so much. Right, so I'm going to go plug this in. Oh, that's the other thing I should probably show you. The switch, if we can get it in frame. I can't get it in frame. I will show you the equivalent on the Redhead, it's much easier. So, our switch, as you can see, is in line on the cable, if that makes sense to you. So the switch is there. This one's marked with off and on. You can hear the clunk from that. ASMR. So I'm coming over here. Right. Oh, okay. So, could you bring the house lights down for me, please, Joel? Right, are they all the way? Just bring them down all the way, thank you. So, that is our 650 without any light. Can you bring up this camera 2 for me? You see, this is quite a powerful light. You know, I'll just duck down here. And you can see, and the quality of the light is very nice. You know, it's not, as much as it's a hard light, you can see as it falls away into the shadows over there. It is a traditional spotlight. That is what it is. If you look on the back of these though, there is a dial to focus the beam. That's what we call a Fresnel lens. Fresnel lenses, the pronunciation goes any which way you like, but that's how they work. Inside of the light is a corkscrew, is a screw system effectively that pulls the actual housing for the bulb backward and forward. And that will then focus the beam or defocus it much in the same way we would on a camera lens. It's a bit complicated, I won't go too much into it now, but if available there, let me show you. See, now look how focused that beam actually is. You know, we can bring it out and we can widen it greatly. You also look at the central spot, look at that central spot behind the chair. See, if you keep your eye on that circle where it is there, if you notice it actually becomes darker at its greatest point. So what you're doing is that central point isn't actually as bright when you widen it out, but you gain a lot more shape on the room. So if we were using this as our key light, a 3-point light, now I will try and cover the 3-point light a little bit, but traditionally we have what we call a 3-point light. We have a 3-point light. I'll give you a clue as to why it's 3 points. We've got 3 different points of light. We have the key, we have the fill, and we have usually what we call a backlight. You are not limited to only 3 points of light. You do not have to use 3 points of light, but the 3-point light is the traditional Hollywood lighting. And Hollywood is mostly what people's basis for cinema is. You know, we can go back through the idea that really it was invented by either the British or the French, and you know, and who really created this storytelling structure and Lumiere and all this blah, 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 blah. Not the scope of what we're dealing with here. What we're dealing with here is the fact that most people will expect from you a 3-point light. So anyway, the 3-point light's very simple, right? We have the 3 points of light. We have what we call the key light. The key light is what it says. It's the key light. It's the light that not just provides the most light or is the most powerful. It is usually that, but it is the light which really determines the angle of the room. Traditionally speaking, you would call it for what the sun is for, you know, or as a replication for the sun. We would then have a fill light. The fill light would be used for filling in. As you can see here, if I stand right inside of this spotlight, it is bright as like the sun, but you can see I've got a lot of shadow around my face. If we look on camera 3, a lot of shadow. You're seeing there's a lot. I am illuminated quite heavily, but there's a lot of shadow coming from over here. But think about it, that you think of a bright day where the sun might be at, say, I don't know, 4 o'clock. It will cut across. You'll have an awful lot of light on one side of the face and a lot of shadow the other. That's what we do. So we'd use a light to fill that back out, and then possibly a backlight, but we'll talk about that in a second. What's the question? We do not have one, but the way you would look for one is you would need a generator. A generator can be garnered in a number of different ways. I have run external lights from a generator. Generators are somewhere between expensive and not. For a group of you would have to hire one externally is what I'm saying, but that's not as complicated as it sounds. Honda do a great little 220 volt small 5 horsepower generator, and if you don't understand what a generator is, some people do, some people don't. A generator is traditionally yes, traditionally, because there are much different kinds. A generator is simply a petrol or diesel engine that is running and turning over basically kind of an alternator, effectively, which is creating power. You know, it's just creating a single, you know, DC drive unit, or it'll be an AC drive unit in this case, and creating a power source for you that you'll plug in. It will run down its little petrol engine and it'll go. I've taken them out on location to power LEDs for a couple of nights of night shooting, and I had a small generator that ran for like 3 days. But you can work your way up onto much larger sets where generators will be hauled by their own lorry. Yeah, I mean, that'll be quite a large thing. For you guys, which I know is the question you're asking, I'm just trying to give you some surrounding information. For you guys, my suggestion would be to ring up a local hire service like HSS or something like that and say how much for a generator for a few days. you know, like 2 or 3 days. You might find it might be as cheap as £40 a day. You might find it, and even if it's £100 a day, if there are a group of 3 or 4 of you, you can split that cost quite easily. You know, it's not that complicated. Would I take that? I would look for my LED options, because I wouldn't always take a generator and a large set of lights. That would be it would have to be a serious consideration for me. I'd have to be saying to myself, high production values, lots of stuff going on. You know, I've got, you know, really, really important scene. It has to look perfect. That's when I do it. And you have to remember, I'm not saying that LEDs aren't good. They are. They can look fantastic as well. I'm just saying tungstens tend to be a bit better. Any more questions, Joel? Brilliant. Joel, do you think I covered it? Brilliant. And whoever posed that in the chat, let us know if that's covered or not, and if you want any follow-up, just ask. Right, so back to the 3-point light. So we can see here that we've got a very, I've got a heavy spotlight. I'm going to open that out a bit, because quite frankly, too heavy a spot is a little bit ugly. See, now you can see that that's that traditional spotlight look. If you look to the side over here, you can see that massive fall away in light. You can see shadow all across here. It's not terribly natural looking. There is another thing for if you're out on location, and that is to work with natural light. That's a very, very important thing. I don't have one with me. I might ask Joel to go get one in a second. But reflectors are very, very, very useful. Remember, the key light is a replacement for the sun. Just a really good replacement for the sun outdoors, the sun. It's wonderful, thank you. I'm glad that cleared that up for you. The sun is incredibly powerful, incredibly useful. You can consider it's a giant ball of flaming hydrogen, like, you know, hundreds of thousands, like it's like 1,000,000 miles away or whatever it is. It's producing a lot of light. And you can use that light, on a bright day, you can use that light very effectively. You just have to take a reflective material, come round to where you would use your fill, and just bounce that light back in. You know, it's incredibly useful, incredibly simple. Right, so I'm going to grab another light stand, this light stand. I may need to get some more light stands in a minute. That I might have to ask you to do. I thought I'd be fine with 5 light stands, but turns out these are modified light stands. Yes, they are heavily modified light stands, so I won't be using those. So here we go, another light stand, very similar to the last. You couldn't bring the house lights up for me just for a second, Joel, could you? Thank you. To make things a little bit easier for everyone. Right, so just here we are, another light. What I think I will do then is actually I'll use an LED. And I'll show you something terribly useful with regards to, Joel, can you go grab me a V-Lock battery, could you? See, that's better. We can show you this much easier now. So, as we can see, we've got, that's for screwing in and out. That goes in there. And the battery will mount on the back here. Now, this is what we call V-Lock. V-Lock is it's industry standard. It is cinema industry standard. Cameras will run off V-Lock batteries. There are adapters to run other items off V-Lock batteries. Lights will run off V-Lock batteries, or they'll have adapters to be run off of V-Lock batteries. V-Lock is a very, very important standard to understand about. I think the one thing I will say about it is it's expensive if you're thinking of purchasing V-Locks to go with you now. But the reason they're expensive is because they're long-lasting, and it's a standard that I don't think people want to get rid of anytime soon. It works, is the basic answer. It's not too high a voltage, it's not too low a voltage, it's not too high current. You know, the current capabilities are perfectly fine. It will power an awful lot of things, and people like to use them. They have value. So I think if you're looking into purchasing stuff and you think to yourself, well, you know, power consumption is an important thing, have a look into V-Locks. They're incredibly useful, and they're very standardized, and they are a thing that if you're looking to charge in any way is a thing that can be understood by other members of the industry. So anyway, so this is our point here. As you can see, there's a V-shape clip here matching with a V-shape, and they just mate together, I believe is the technical term. Come on. So that will go into place. You'll hear a click. I don't know whether that picked up on my microphone or not. And there's a simple on-off switch. And this is one of the reasons why you may want to take out LED panels. That's ready to go. It's also light enough. Ooh, lost a slide out of there. It's also light enough that if I choose to hold it, I can just carry it around. I can light someone with it. I could choose to light the chair. You know, you can see that there, and it doesn't gain heat. Sorry, it doesn't emit much heat, which means there's very little energy wastage in heat, which means there should be more power powering the LEDs. The LEDs are very low draw. You could leave this on for a long time. It'll pack up quickly. You know, I don't want it to be misunderstood that as much as I don't want it to be misunderstood that yes, I prefer yes, I prefer tungstens, but LEDs have their place. They can be incredibly useful. Right, so I'm going to pop this back up on here. So Joel, I'll probably skip over to, he's already there. Wonderful. Well ahead of me. So I'm going to pop this on here, tighten it into place. House lights down for me. He knows it, he knows it. And I'm going to pop these on. I say house lights, but I mean studio lights. Now, can you see, if we pop onto, can we pop onto camera 2 again for me, please? Thank you. I'm going to turn this off and I'm going to turn it on, and you will see a difference, but it won't be grand. So I've got it here, off, on. So, well, I say it won't be grand. It's quite a big difference, but can you see how there's very little effect on me here. You'll see there's a patch here that's being lit up, and that's gone. You know, but what we're doing is we're creating a much more even light, but this is going to cast a large shadow over here, and there's a shadow behind me here. Ooh, there you go. So that is another problem with lighting. You will create shadows. You'll create an awful lot of shadows. Every light source you creates shadows. Now, if you look, if I come back to about here, oh, no, this way, you'll see that this light is cancelling out the shadow being created by this light, and from this angle you can't see much of a shadow because I'm covering it, I'm close to my source. But if I move closer to the source, you see that it offsets the shadow around me, and also if I come this way, you can see roughly my shadow appearing here, and the more I move over here, the greater it becomes, and the more I move into this one, the more it's diminished, right? I know this is they're not the world's greatest camera angles for this. I would actually prefer a third camera angle, well, fourth camera angle. I have my third camera angle, but I think I'll be using that when I set up a light over here. So, you're working with a lot of different points of view, but you have to remember, we're really only lighting for one camera at the minute, and that camera is camera 2. I'm going to pop that up a little bit. And it is cooking a little hot on this side of the face, but that's all right, I don't mind that. So I'm going to come up a little bit before I show you what's in the bag, when I will want to come down a smidgen. So here I am. You know, you've got a lot of light coming from up here, you've got a lot of light coming up from up here, but this LED, because it's quite close, is really very warm on my face. So I wish I could see this a little bit larger, but sadly I can't. Joel, how warm do you think it is on here? Quite warm? Yeah. Well, we'll get to that one in a minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull down the old 4K. Yeah, thank you, Joel. So you can see over here, like, I've got 2 dials. My phone would provide a perfect light. In fact, it's going to. So I don't know how powerful this will be. But is that just pulling that out a little bit? It's just pulling it out a little bit. Is that highlighting those dials enough? Good. Right, so I've got, before I put my hand away, I've got a dial here and a dial here. These are for the 2 different color temperatures. We'll cover that in a minute. Once again, are there any questions in YouTube chat? Right, wonderful. So we've got 2 dials here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull back on half of this and pull it back there. So you're controlling the light, the power of light across 2 different types of light. And we'll have a look at that more in situ in a minute. But for right now, so I've got quite a bright light here. It's still a little bright for me. So what, very warm one might say. It's overexposed. What's happening is that light is too bright. Now there are a number of ways to take that down. The first is we've dialed it back a bit. And by dialing it back a bit, we have reduced the amount of light it outputs. I'm going to look down the camera. I can't stop looking at the monitor over there, which is ridiculous. So I've reduced it from the light source itself. So it's still very hot on my face. Now there are a number of different ways there are 2, maybe 3 more ways we can sort of change this now. So the first is we can still reduce further the output from the light. Now that's fine because we have dimmers set into the LEDs, which is very helpful. But most of the tungsten lights come without dimmers. The little 100 watts come with dimmers. Excuse me, Joel, I'm still talking down the lens. The 100 watts come with dimmers. But the 650s and the redheads do not come with dimmers. Yes, almost exclusively do not come with dimmers. But what we can do, and one of the things that is quite useful, is there's a theory I'll ask you to look up. I'm not going to try and explain it right now. I'd need a whiteboard. There's something called inverse square law, which is very simple. If a light moves away from a subject, the amount of light that reaches it is diminished. Therefore, it's much darker. So with this light, because we've got a bit of space behind it, one of the things I can do is move it back. So if we cut back to the other camera, Joel, wonderful, you can see that it's actually fairly close to here. I can bring this back. I can move it back to about here, and hopefully there'll be a reduction in the amount of light that falls upon me. So see, there's a diminishing of the light that's falling across me now. It's not quite as dark. See, obviously what we're only working with right now is how we'd use the lights to do this. If you're, as you know, the terminology we'd use for the person working with the lights would be a gaffer. A gaffer is traditionally the person in charge of lights. Cinematographer, well, camera operator would be dealing with the camera, right? And the cinematographer generally is overseeing the whole shebang. So probably our cam op would be saying, I can come down 2 stops, I can come up 2 stops. Whilst we're dealing with the lighting, we can come down 2 stops, we can come up 2 stops. Right now, we're only dealing with lighting. If you find that your lighting is in positions you like, it might be... You're still getting a bit of feedback? Okay, let me pull it down a little bit. What you can find is coming down. So, what you can find is working between the two of you, you'll be able to do that. Right now, we're just dealing with the lights. That's all we're dealing with right now, because it would be nigh on impossible for me to expect Joel to do the sound in there, the gallery in there, and deal with the old vision broadcast, vision engineering. So, pardon me. So what we're going to do, what's our question? I will get to diffusion in a minute. So we'll have a look at that in a second. So, right now what we're dealing with is we've moved our different points around. For the time being, we've got a lot of bounce back, so I won't be dealing with that. But like you said, so one of the things we're looking at is that right now I'd say that the 650 that we're using as our key light is still quite hot, still quite warm. I'm not stepping it down in the camera. To be honest, right now, to find the correct exposure, I would stop down on camera. I would probably either add some ND or I would come up to say like an F4 maybe. But obviously you might say to yourself, well, I don't want to stop up anymore. I like my delicious creamy backgrounds. I want to get all that focus out, no focus on the background at all. Which once again at F4, if you're selective with your camera position, you will be happily having a completely out of focus background. But if you don't have much space to come back or move forward or any of those things, what we can do is then start working with gels. Now for our person with the softbox question, I can come and answer these things. We use gels mostly when we want to shape light in a way that is, how do I describe this best? Well, we want to color light, we might want to soften our light, we might want to even diminish our light. If any of you know the C100, or if you've done much research yourselves, you'll understand about ND filters. ND stands for neutral density. The neutral density means that it does not change the colour of the light, which is terribly important. We don't want to change the colour of the light. So a neutral density filter like this. This is a 2-stop, or 0.6, gets a bit complicated with the old NDs, but basically this will reduce the light by a quarter, just one sheet of this. So at the minute I'm looking up there and I'm seeing that that's too bright. So what I will also need is I'll need some clips, which I'm going to have to check in the cupboard for. There should be some clips in here. Wonderful, there are. So, as I'm going to be dealing with a hot light, I will need some gloves on, at least one, preferably two. And I honestly mean this, people. You have to be using the gloves with these lights. They are the type of injury you'd receive from using the lights. I will look up there now. The type of injury you'd receive from these lights is pretty immense. Now, here's the other thing. You can see as we're swapping from camera to camera, this light is too bright on that camera, as you can tell. And if Joel was to cut to this camera 3, you know, you look at me over there and the lighting is all off. I've got a lot too much light there. This really isn't lighting enough of this face here. You really are trying to make sure that you are lighting for a single shot. You can't, it's very complicated. If you have enough lights, you can light a room and then proceed to light a figure in the room continuously. Like that's a thing that you should be doing. But if you only have 3 lights, you're going to have to set up your lighting for every shot and be considered about it, be smart about it. Usually you want to leave your key where it is, but you'll need to move that fill around. And remember, we could get into the grounds of motivation and the motivation of a light, you know, whether it's a practical or whether it's sunlight or whether it's completely unmotivated. It's, you know, it's story driven, if you see where I'm coming from. But you want to be considerate with your lighting. That's where the lighting plans come from. It's creating the ideal look and then sort of working with it from there. But that's an interpretation thing. I won't worry too much about that. So we are looking at gels. So this light is quite bright. So we've got 2 choices. If we're happy with how sharp the light is, we can just use the ND. The ND will not soften, the ND will not colour. All it will do is diminish the power of the light. So, let me take these gloves off. I can take this one off for a second. As you can see, we've got, there we go. Right, I'm going to, these are a bit of a pain to work with. So, if you look at this, it is just a sheet of what looks like clear, darkened plastic, and that effectively is all it is. If I was to bring it in front of the camera lens, you can see how it just reduces the overall exposure. That's all it does. And that's what the ND filter in the C100s does. It just adds a layer of this, much thicker, and it just places it in front of the sensor. And you can place, it has 3 in rotation. So it's clicking those over and adding that over to it. But in this case, we don't want to diminish the light that's coming out of here. We're fairly happy with that. It's this one that we think is a little bit strong. So all I'm going to do, pop this other glove on. You want to be careful with these. Like I said, these barn doors get incredibly hot, and I mean, you know, trip to A&E hot, not, ow, that's a little warm. You know, and this is why we have health and safety. So, all I do is, it's very difficult for you to see this up here. I lift it in front of the light, and I take the bulldog clip and clip it onto the barn door. Can you? Oh, brilliant. So it clips it onto the barn door. So now if I sit back in again, that looks a lot nicer, I'd say, personally. Especially if you frame it in a nice close-up, and you can see. Now, importantly, that keeps that sharpness of the light. We're quite happy with how sharp the light is. Now, if we wanted to soften that light, we were not happy with it being like that. We can use diffusion instead. As you can see, diffusion looks very, very different. We've got it cut into multiple different sizes. I think there are multiple different thicknesses in there. Well, I won't go thicknesses. What we would call grades, basically. And we talk about things in stops. I'll give a very brief explanation of stops, but that could be a whole discussion in its own right. If we were to reduce a light source, well, if you talk about exposure, when you go from f-stops, if you go from, say, 1.8 to 2, or 2 to 2.4, or say something like that, what you're doing is you're changing by one stop, which means you're either doubling or halving the amount of light that's being let into the camera. We can do that with a light source as well, much in the same way we could pop the ND on. So if I've got a half stop of diffusion, what that means is I'm reducing the light by a quarter, because if you reduce by one stop, you reduce by a half. If you reduce by half a stop, it's a quarter. Now, if you were to reduce, this is where it gets complicated. If you reduce by 2 stops, you're reducing it to a quarter, or by 3/4. I know it sounds quite odd, but obviously you're going by a half, a half, a half, a half, a half. So if you had a quarter stop, you'd be reducing by an eighth, I believe. Once again, I don't expect you to come away knowing this. I don't expect you to be, I don't expect you to understand it necessarily, but what I'm saying is that there's a lot of these ways to speak about lighting that are quite complicated and in-depth, and you can come and ask Aaron or I or Carly or whoever. You can have a chat to us about it, because it is something we would know about. So, diffusion in regards to ND. ND reduces the output of light, full stop, but it doesn't colour and it doesn't soften, right? Diffusion will soften the light. Now, what we're referring to there is, I know that we've already spoke about softboxes. Softening the light is about how hard that light appears. And I know it sounds obvious, but if you can see behind me my shadow has a very defined edge. The edge is very defined. If I was to use a diffusion, the shadow would have a much softer edge to it, and I'll show you that in a second. Now, the thing about this is it will reduce the amount of light that comes out as well. ND only reduces the light and doesn't colour it and doesn't soften it. Diffusion will soften it and reduce. Whatever happens, whatever kind of filter you use, you will be softening the light, you will be reducing it. Because what you're doing is you're blocking the amount of light that can reach something, but you're shaping it at the same time. So this is half stop of ND. I'm just going to go quickly unclip this and we'll have a look at the difference between the two. Right. Once again, be careful. These shouldn't get too hot, but once again, always be careful with these. So I'm just going to lift this up here. Place that on there. Also, be careful not to blind yourself. It's very, very bright. Right, I'm going to lift that over there. I'm just going to use these barn doors to just shape that light a smidge. You might have seen that over there. That's lost some of that rounded edge. Right, now if you look at my shadow in the background, you should see it's a little bit softer. That's fine. Right, so if I lift this up, there you go. You can see that quality of shadow increase and decrease. Very harsh, hard shadow, much softer. You can also see that reduction in light, and you can see the softness in the light. This will be much more difficult to see, but you'll see the definition between where the light from one side comes in, this blue, and the light from that more orange tungsten comes in is here. What I would like to say is, yes, we use the gels instead of the soft boxes. The soft boxes won't attach, is the other thing to remember. In here we do have one of our LED lights. We have what we call the Godox. These are new. These have come in only recently. You can see it's a very powerful LED. Let's see if I can get that. Can you see the size of that LED chip there? That's all LED. So these use what we call Bowen mounts. We do have a softbox for these sat down here. Here's the scrim for it. The thing to understand about the softboxes is for that is they are set up into Bowen's mount. Here is the Bowen's mount for the softbox. You see the holes on the side there. I don't know how well you can see those. They have the poles for it to go in, and then you pull the tent around, and then you add the scrim to the front, and then these lock in place. Don't know if you can hear that on the thing. And they lock in place there. Now, there is no Bowen's mount on the on either the LED panel or on the Redheads or the Arris. There just isn't one. And the reasoning being is because the diffusion you're going to use will either be tucked in, because there's a honeycomb insert in most of them, which prevents any kind of issues should the bulbs go, which I will talk about in a minute. But also what it allows for is it sharpens the light. You know, it sort of passes it all in one direction. It sort of makes it appear a little bit better. I've never been able to notice the difference, but then again, my eye for these things isn't the world's greatest. These do get hot at this point. I'm going to bring this a little closer so you can see. What you will be able to see here is the LED chip, but also we have a massive piece of aluminium. Anybody who knows their computer parts will know that this is acting purely as cooling. That is just wicking that heat off of it, much in the same way you would in a PC part. These produce a hideously large amount of heat. I wouldn't use the gels on them either. I mean, you could use them, but if a gel was to touch that LED, it will burn. If the if the gel is not good quality. Now that is the one thing I would say, if you're looking at, gels go wonderful over the LEDs as well. I mean, the LEDs don't output so much power, so you have to remember if you're dealing with a 800 watt light and you then put one stop of ND on that, that becomes a 400 watt light. If you're dealing with, say, a 200 watt equivalent, like I think these panels are roughly 200 watt equivalent, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. You're dealing with a 100 watt light, and a 100 watt light's not very powerful. It's not nothing. You could light a room, well, you could light a person with one, but you couldn't light a room with one. And I think you need to remember that. The other thing to remember is that you can, to a very certain extent, add one or two gels together, but they will have a cumulative effect. So, let me put this Godox back. If we look at our scene, our shots right now, our nice shot here, it looks all right. It's perfectly passable. It's not perfect, but it's considered. If we were to look at it though, we can see that there's a colour temperature difference. I don't mind the colour temperature difference. I actually think that sometimes a colour temperature difference, if considered and chosen and not due to sloppy handling, can actually really enliven a scene. You want to toy with your colours. You want to show that you're being interested. So if we were to look at this, someone might say, well, you know, you're using a tungsten light on one side and you've got the blue LED on the other. Well, this LED could be set to be tungsten balanced rather than daylight balanced, but I don't want to go that way. I quite like it being daylight balanced. I think the cool tone's very, you know, it can be useful in certain scenarios. It can make it, you know, we can choose to have things colder if you're doing some kind of documentary about, I don't know, serial killers or something, and you want to talk about something which is incredibly dark and brooding, and you want to use blue light to really highlight some of that stuff, then you might want to make sure that you bring your tungsten lights back down. And this is why we have what we call CTB. CTB stands for colour temperature, the B stands for blue. This is a quarter stop. I believe it's quarter stop. This actually might be half stop. I think that's actually half stop. So I'll look at that in a second. But, sorry, you're going to get all kinds of rattling and rustling. Now, if you look at that there, that can be happily placed onto our light, and we can then have a blue light, a blue soft light from our tungsten. Now, the one thing I would be careful of is you've got to remember, if this is a half stop and that's roughly a half stop, that means a whole stop reduction on a 650 watt light, which means it's then 325 watt, right? So then you're not too far away from where that is, and that will be quite clear. So this will start really comparing, or even starting to overpower. So you want to be careful with how you're managing those lights and dialing it in and out. This is why it can take hours to properly light a shoot, and why the gaffer does so much work in that regard. You know, a great person talked about is Aaron. Aaron has a great interest in lighting. He's very good at it, very knowledgeable on it now, and I would go and speak to him about it, and also has a great interest in it, you know. So you have to be interested in these things to take the time to look into them. So anyway, we're going to go put this up here now. I'm going to grab an extra glove because I really don't want to get burnt by that barn door. I'm sure I already mentioned they're called barn doors, didn't I? So I'm pulling this off. You know, you don't want to be stacking too many of these, but it can be a very useful thing to do. if you're trying to get a very specific effect. So, I'm bringing it down here. Right, there we go, we're all clipped in place. Now, you can see instantaneously looking at this chair just quite how that colour has changed. You can also see how it has heavily affected the light output. So before we were worrying about, oh, it's a bit harsh, it's very, you know, there's a lot of light going on, and it seemed like it doesn't take long from shaping the light to suddenly start seeing that, oh, it's got quite low, we're dealing with quite low levels of light. That is quite a powerful light. You might then sit there and go, well, you know, we've got a half stop of diffusion, half stop of CTB. That means we've got a full stop down on it, and it's a 650, so that's a 350. Would it be better to get 50 watts extra and swap it out for a redhead? Once again, it's all time. It's all time you're going through. This is the type of thing that you need to practice with. Take the lights, learn how they work. Put some diffusion on them. What does 2 stops of diffusion look like? What does 4 stops of diffusion look like? What does it, you know, how long does it take to cool down? This will take quite a while to cool down, because once we turn all this off, it's going to take us a little while for me and Joel to pack it all up. You know, you need to play with these things, because when you go out on a recce then, you will know, looking at a room, you'll go, wow, this is going to need 3 redheads to fill this out, and we're going to have to make sure if we're going to use the internal lights at all as like a motivation, they're all going to be orange tinted, so we need the tungsten. But if we bring the LEDs in, we're going to have to push those LEDs to make them red. Or if we only have blue LEDs, because the Godox is color balanced blue, you can't change the white balance on that. You'll need to use CTO to bring that back round. But then again, if you're using a half stop of CTO to try and get it to match with the tungsten lights, you are then bringing something which is no longer, I think it's about 300 watt it's supposed to be. Let me check the side of it again. Oh, it's only got its thingy watt. It's equivalent, so let's say it's equivalent to 300 watt. You are then going to be dealing with 150 instead. So once again, all these thoughts need to be running through when you're planning, because it will save you time later on. If you're shooting in a house, you have to be careful with the amount of things you are using, because much like, you know, if you plug the vacuum in and the kettle and the oven all downstairs and flick all the lights on, suddenly it trips the breaker. You can do that with these lights. That is a thing to consider, you know, but we can cover that if people are actually interested. I'm going to quickly grab this extension lead. This is supposed to be our key. This is our fill. As you can see right now, this is actually probably ended up closer to our fill just because of the way, our key, just because of the way this has diminished in light quality or light output from the diffusion and the color correction we've added to it. What we're doing there is we have our main light, our side light, you know, our fill. It's bringing it out, because if we look at it with and without, come on, turn you off. If you look at me just here without, you can see it very much, it's very shadowy here. And there's nothing, and it can look really nice. It can be a thing in its own right. You know, obviously we talk about the film noir, we talk about the high key lighting. That's what this is about. It's just across here. It looks like you're using very little light, but what you're actually using is very powerful light. And using here, there was famously, Cronenworth, which Cronenworth? Name escapes me. Cronenworth Senior, he, on Blade Runner, would famously use very powerful lights close to the actor, and what would happen is as that light spilled across, because it was so strong, it would fill out the other side as well from reflection. You know, you can use some very creative tools to bolster how you're working with your light, but we've made sure that we've got a nice far away light over here. It's powerful, but it's far away. Now, the other thing to remember about when you move a light far away is it softens the quality of the light. You'll see that in the shadows over here. You'll see they're quite soft because of the distance away the light is. So, I'm just going to use this small tripod. I will be honest, I don't usually like these. They aren't the world's greatest tripods, light stands in my opinion. Do not put a large light on these. These are only for placing small lights upon them. I'm only using the Godox on here because it will be the lowest one we can possibly get. Let me just bring this down. Now, the Godox has a number of different things. It also has a remote, which is terribly helpful. It's really nice if you want to stand in scene, stand in situ, you know, stand away from the light and stand next to the camera. You know, if you need to do that to work out what's going on, it's absolutely brilliant for that, thanks to the remote. And the remote will allow you to turn it on and off as well, which is incredibly helpful. You know, you want to be able to do that to get an idea of what's going on. Right, so we'll place this on. What you'll see is this is an incredibly powerful light. It's not really what you would want to use for a backlight in a lot of cases. Let me just plug that in here. Ugh, this is an awful, awful light stand. It'll be fine for a second because I think once I've demonstrated this, if there are no further questions, I will most likely call it a day. So we're in here. Ooh, as you can see, very, very, very powerful light. That's at 100%. Now, if you see what it looks like when I block it, you can see why you'd use it. It's taken me away from that background. Look across here. You've put it right behind me, and it's added something. It's added a depth and a dimension to the frame. That's really the point about it. You use that backlight to remove someone from the frame. You look at me here. Now let me turn it off. You look at me there. It doesn't add that removal. You need that removal sometimes. Now, a backlight doesn't always have to be directly behind somebody. You can move it to the side depending on where you want to lift them and how you want to lift them. But for right now, we'll add it just straight on the back here. Remember, try and always warn people when you're turning lights on, because that way they'll know. They'll have an idea of how powerful you think it's going to be. Do you see what I mean? You can see how powerful that can be. Now, this is at its lowest setting. I think that's about 10%. And I sit here, and it just adds a little bit off frame. If I was doing an interview of some kind, I'd be talking to somebody, and you just get a little bit of animation along the side there, a little bit of depth, a little bit of added interest. You know, especially if you were to punch in tight to a close-up at this point, you know, it really would add something else. So as I'd be talking, you could see that maybe I'd be, you know, animated, and it just adds a little something going on with a shadow around it. Sometimes you can bring a light into frame as well. That can add a little bit of texture, a little bit of interest. You know, we can use that across here. You know, and that can sometimes add something to look at or something of interest, but it's not so nice like this. You really want to add it so that it's, you know, it's added something to look at. But it very much depends on your scenario, and it wants to be something that you're doing to illustrate your scene, because that's one of the things we haven't talked about is how to lay out your practical lighting, because as I said earlier, I did mention practicals within the motivation of lighting. Practicals are things that are in situ. If they exist, they are lights. So you might have a lamp, you might have street lights, you might have anything like that, and that can motivate your lighting. If we were, say, outside and you had and you wanted to produce a very, okay, let's go for what everyone wants to do. You wanted that 90s street lamp look, where you look at what happened when there was a lot of sodium lighting. Now, sodium lighting is very, very, very orange. I mean, probably about as orange as you can get. We're talking about 3,000 Kelvin. I would cover temperature balance a little more, but I won't be today. Now, those 3,000 Kelvin lights, what you would do is you'd probably take an already tungsten light, add some CTO to it. Maybe a half stop, maybe a full stop of CTO to it. You'll reduce the light, but you'll get an incredibly orange light. Now you take that from above somebody. Now you create a very, very sodium look, high key as well, because it's that key light. It's the key light that's lighting the scene, especially if you're working at night, because you know, street lamps. And then you might want to fill that in. Now you can motivate that fill by maybe it being a passing car, you know, a parked car. Or perhaps you're doing a nighttime stakeout scene or a nighttime shady deal. There's a shady deal going on. You will have a high, just if someone has a car, park it up, stick it on main beams. Now what you have there is you have two key lights effectively. They're two light sources that are your high key lighting, and you have very little fill from elsewhere. Maybe you have a little orange glow bounced back on them from an LED or a little ARRI 100. We have 150. We have little ARRI 150s. Put a bit of CTO on that, and that can be like a street lamp that's being used as the fill. Now all of that light is motivated then. All of that light, you know where it came from in the scene. You know why it exists. And it really, but you control it as well. It's not just because it was there, you considered it. And that's another thing. I mentioned the recce before and I'll mention the recce again. You have to go and look at places. You have to go and have a think about them. And when you start looking for different things, on the practicality front of lighting, you start going, where's the power going to come from? Perhaps you can run an extension lead from somewhere. If you're working at a park, say, you might go, well, if we shoot in this direction, it looks like park and empty. But really, they're behind us. There's a ranger's cabin or something where you run an extension lead out of there and you can power a few lights. You know, but when you start looking at it from a practical on-screen lighting point of view, you might start saying to yourself, well, I can see over there, you know, big moonlight, okay, so we want a large soft light source, we're going to have it high angled, you know, we want LED for that, or we want to have a tungsten light, you know, a 1K with we don't have 1Ks, but we have the 800 watt ARRIs with a bit of CTB over it, you know, not much, like a half stop and say a quarter stop even, just to take some of that orange out of it. And then we start adding a lot of blue in post. We know we might do that. There's a ranger's place over there, and that can be seen in the back of a shot, and that can motivate some light. But once again, also remembering that in your editing, you have to remember that you are you're motivating those light sources. You have to be aware of those surroundings. Sometimes that's the reason for a really good establishing shot will help motivate those light sources and the way they're going to work around you. Anyway, I think I have talked enough, especially seeing as it... Oh, what? That is a wonderful thing. Yes, thank you, Kerry. Of course. You have to remember that the ND filters are not just for placing over the lights that we have. They can be used for anywhere, any sort of light source. Another great, so place them, as Kerry said, over household lights. If you've got lights that are in a house that you just want to be practicals, they're not for anything other than appearing in the background, well, stick a bit of ND on them. Chop out a nice square, layer it over the top, make sure they're not too hot, obviously. But you know, the ND filter, you know, the ND gels are designed to withstand an awful lot of temperature. The other thing as well that I forgot to mention, which Kerry is thankfully very much reminding me of, is if you have a window in the back of a shot and you cannot for the life of you balance the exposure you've got in front of you as well as that window into the background, and you're not shooting something like RAW, then you are going to cut out a sheet of ND and tape it to that window, and you'll instantaneously bring some detail back in that window, stop it blowing out, and it will not affect the scene so much. You'll be able to control it much better. If you're doing nighttime shoots, it's very easy just to chuck a black sheet or something up behind it, but if you want to be able to see out that window, cutting up some ND for that window can be really, really helpful, but try and make sure you keep it to the pane size, because you won't find those edges in the edge of the pane. But if you cut two sheets and try and stick them together, we'll immediately see an edge down the middle. So, and that'll completely ruin the illusion. But yes, thank you, Kerry. That's incredibly helpful. Right, then I'm going to leave that. That was a little demonstration, a little statement in how to light, a little introduction. If you have any questions, come find me, email me. My email is obviously lawrence.mabry@northampton.ac.uk, which I'm not going to, well, I've given that out online, that's fine. And I would just come find me at the tech office and I'll have a chat about it. If there's anything else you want to cover, if there's anything in here that just sounded like jargon and gobbledygook, I will talk more of it at you until you understand it. anytime. So, thank you very much.